Today, we're going to talk about the Mayflower Compact. We have to go all the way back to Henry VIII in England to how this came together to be the first device in American history on American soil that involved the idea of self government and religious freedom. As we're all very familiar with, Henry VIII wanted to divorce his first wife, and he did so by separating from the Catholic Church. He set up what was the Church of England with himself as the supreme head, taking the place of the Pope. And he also did this because he wanted all the money from the monasteries. But as far as the rites and ceremonies and beliefs, he actually kept most of what the Catholics believed. Well, in the 1600s, not only with the exploration of the New World, there also came about a big religious fervor, and people began to think differently away from the church, and Martin Luther came along, and all these things happened that got people thinking and discussing. And for the first time in a very long time, people were actually able to start reading the Bible in their own languages, was the invention of the printing press. As a result of this, two groups sprang up in England over a period of many decades. The first group came to be known as the Puritans, and their idea was we're not happy with what it looks like, but we're going to change it from within. Now, the other group came to be known as the Separatists or the Pilgrims, and their idea was no, we're starting completely over. This will be a lot better if we just start from the beginning. So, William Brewster, who lived in England, had started this group and was kind of their spiritual guide. And one of his proteges was William Bradford, which you should recognize as the person that um, came up with the Mayflower Compact and was the governor of the Plymouth colony for many years. Anyway, these guys got together, and over a series of events, they decided they couldn't stay in England. They were being persecuted and prosecuted. So they decided to go to the Netherlands. There was a place in the Netherlands that actually gave you religious freedom. So they went there and they got pretty prosperous and they were doing pretty well, but they noticed something. Their children were starting to be more like the Dutch and less like them. And they began to worry about the influence of the world in which they were raising their children. So they came up with the idea that we're going to go to the New World and we're going to start so that we can teach our children the way that we feel they should be taught. So they came up with this idea. They got funds from people in England, and they came up with two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The two ships started out, and the Speedwell had a leak. They took it back to the shipyard. They fixed the leak, so they thought. They start back again on their trip, and the Speedwell continued to leak. So they all got aboard the Mayflower, which was a cargo ship, not a passenger ship. So there was no luxury here. It was about 102 people, 30 crew members, and it included two women who were going to have babies. And one had it on the voyage over, and one had it just as they got to America. They crossed the New World during the worst part of the storms in the Atlantic, and they went through a lot of bad things. And they had a patent. You had to have a patent to be able to establish a colony in the New World. And they had a patent for Northern Virginia, which oddly enough is what today is New York. But they got off kilter and they ended up in what became Plymouth, Massachusetts, or Cape Cod area. And they decided that they liked the Cape Cod area and they wanted to stay there because they really hadn't intended to stay in the New World under any kind of English influence because, again, they were seeking religious freedom and the opportunity for self government. So while they were off the land, just going back and forth in little rowboats, they came up with what they called the Mayflower Compact. The actual document was lost during the Revolutionary War, but we know what it said and we know how it read because William Bradford, who I mentioned earlier, wrote it down in his diary and his journals. Another reason to be keeping good journals. Anyway, it was just a one page, one paragraph essay, and it basically said we all agree that we're going to govern through the will of the people and we're going to allow religious freedom. And that's basically all it said. It was signed by all the men, the free men that were on the ship. So they went into Plymouth, they established a colony, they made friends with the local Native Americans. They traded back and forth with things. The Native Americans taught them how to grow corn, taught them different things. The colonists taught the Native Americans different things. And it actually ended up that our very first Thanksgiving happened in this colony with this people. And that's the story of the Mayflower Compact. Why is it so important to us, Bryce?
I think like one of the main things is especially kind of how you mentioned it's the beginning of religious freedom in the New World. And it was like the first beginning part of we're gonna have the people governed because they're away from England, they're away from a dictator. And so now it's up to them to kind of decide how they want to go about their life, how they want to kind of decide what laws are going to happen where they are. And so it's important to realize like that was a precursor to everyone wanting freedom and independence. But I mean, one of the things though, kind of going a little bit more in depth with history that I find interesting about the Mayflower was kind of how you mentioned the what was the other ship again? Not the
The
Mayflower, but
Spidwell, the Spedwell,
the
or Speedwell,
Speedwell.
depending on how you might pronounce
Yeah,
that.
the interesting thing about that was the way in which it was constructed. It was designed purposefully to leak, and kind of just showing like there were people who were supposedly helping, but they had an ulterior motive, and they purposefully made it so that it would leak. And it was a very easy change that they can make to not let it leak. All they had to do is kind of just adjust the sails in a small little way, and it would have stopped the pull, it would have stopped the leaking. And so it's interesting on how throughout the whole thing there was opposition, but they still kept going. They still kept trying to do the best they could to get to where they wanted to be so they could have their freedom.
It's interesting to me that I guess to us today, this idea that the government would hem you in and cause you to think a certain way and be a certain way is kind of so un-American, so
Mm,
anti-American that we really can't even conceive of a time that people were actually harassed from continent to continent to continent just in search of I want to worship the way I want to worship because
mm,
that's kind of something that we sort of live and breathe. Yeah, freedom of religion. That's right. Even if you want to worship the Church of Satan, unfortunately, yes. You know, Joseph Smith
yeah.
said, you can do this. This is important. But for us, it's hard to imagine that people would actually do those kind of things, like you said, like, deliberately cause these people or persecute them or even try to influence their children. And yet, in a way, are we not there again?
Yep.
We kind of are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also interesting on how this very much mirrored or kind of was a foreshadowment of the restoration. Because once Joseph Smith received the plates and started the entire restoration of the gospel and the church was reorganized, it was persecution from state to state to state, and until they found a place where they were able to actually put settlement. They didn't have to worry about the prosecution, and they were actually able to be free to start practicing what they wanted to practice. And something kind of mentioning Joseph Smith that is actually really interesting, because I was doing a little bit of research because I was really curious about who in American history that were like high, like important people were descendants from those who came aboard the Mayflower. There was one individual during one of the fiercest storms that they went through who fell overboard.
Hmm.
And it said that when he fell overboard, he caught hold of a rope, he was 10 feet below the sea, and then he was pulled up out of the water. His name was John Howland.
That's right.
And
Yeah. Good story.
his descendants, he had three American presidents, Franklin D. Roosevelt, George W. H. Bush, and George W. Bush, Ralph Waldo Emerson, but also Joseph and Hiram Smith are his descendants.
There you
And
go.
so it's interesting to kind of think about that because they all like even John Howland, they attributed his rescue by to be a miracle, to be divinely like grabbed out of the sea almost. And
Was. And in that time when you fell off the boat, that was pretty much it for you. You were gone,
mhm.
you know. And
So
the fact that what struck me as you're going through this is the way Heavenly Father sets all this up to guide us to the principle of free agency, of freedom of religion. And I think it's Family Search that actually has a record of all the descendants of the Mayflower passengers. And you can go in and kind of trace back to see if you are related to any of them. I
yeah,
don't know if I am or not. I haven't tried it yet, but I'd like to see if I am.
yeah. But it's so interesting because I wonder if John Howland was ever wondering, well, why did he save me?
Yeah,
Like, why did he preserve my life? And then for us, looking back at who came from his lineage or came down his line, it's like, well, that's probably why.
yeah,
And President Ballard talked about it, and he talked about how it's like we need to recognize the miracles in our lives. We need to record them. We need to share them with our friends and family. And it's like sometimes we might not realize the impact we're currently making, but just as being alive, doing the good things that we're trying to do, it's going to play an impact in the future, whether great or small. And so it's like we can't minimize that, even if it's a very small little impact.
that's right. And like I said, the fact that William Bradford kept such detailed journals is the reason that we have the what was in the Mayflower Compact, because the document itself disappeared and no one really knows what happened to it. Um, Probably in a warehouse somewhere along with the Ark of the Covenant. But yes, you never know the influence you're going to have on history. You never know when
Mm,
something just as simple as my child is speaking Dutch and growing up in the Dutch way, and this isn't what I wanted for them. To not call that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, guiding them and directing them and kind of pushing them, no matter, like you said, in the persecution, I mean, after, twice the ship, maybe we should give this up. Maybe this isn't a good plan. Maybe it's not a good time. Maybe we shouldn't do it this way. And yet they persevered even through the storms in the Atlantic. And when they got to Cape Cod, it was, like later in the year, and they kind of had to survive without those Native Americans who were open to trading and working with them. I mean, it was all, kind of pre-planned by Heavenly
yeah,
Father.
yeah. It was also kind of interesting because in the reading that I was looking at with the Mayflower, before everyone left, when they're trying to find someone to take them on the voyage, to kind of be their captain, if you will, one of the people that they actually talked to was Captain John Smith with Pocahontas. And I thought it was very interesting because with what I was reading, where it talked about how they went to Cape Cod after John Smith's experience with Pocahontas and the Indians there, he did another voyage that took him to Cape Cod, but he was wanting, if he was going to be accepted as their captain, wanted to go back to Jamestown.
Right.
And it would have been very interesting if he had been their captain and they still got to Cape Cod. because he had already experienced everything there.
Right.
So he would have been able to show them where to go, or the Indians, he might have had some sort of interaction with them. So they could have already had a good relation with them to really help them out. And they turned him down. And according to John Smith, who I think found out about their whole experience, ended up saying if they had taken me, or if they had at least consulted with my maps, they would have been perfectly fine and knowing where to go. But apparently they didn't care. They wanted to figure it out on their own. And so it's like, what resources do we have in our day that's we're just neglecting to use because of our own pride, because we want to try to figure it out on our own when someone else has already done it?
I can think of a lot of things. How about you, Deb? Well, we don't treasure the Book of Mormon. President Benson said we're not doing as good a job with it, and we're still under that. No recent prophet after Benson has lifted that. That we should be doing the Book of Mormon. Did you all see where we've now? I think it's published or given away the 200 millionth copy of the Book of Mormon. I think that's pretty cool. But
Mm-hmm.
obviously, we're not utilizing it as faithfully as we should. And since this is the year to study it, um, it's hard to keep reading over and over again. So, maybe everyone could think of a different way. Like, I decided this year I was going to do it topically instead of
Mm-hmm.
chronologically. And the main reason is because in December, our bishop challenged us to read the Book of Mormon in the month of December, and I did. And it's like, I don't want to go through it chronologically again. So I just thought I'd go through it topically.
I mean, I know Elder Bednar even mentioned, like, with reading the Book of Mormon, what he does is he'll take a new copy, and as he's going through from the beginning to the end, he only marks up things based on a certain topic for that copy.
Yeah.
And then he does it again with a different topic, and then he does it again with a different topic. And I'm like, you must have an entire library devoted to just Book of Mormons, just shelved right there with a little piece of paper saying faith, salvation, atonement. Like, how, like, I want to read what he wrote on the margins on each little thing.
Yeah.
But it's true though, it's like we don't utilize the Book of Mormon as much as we should, and we sometimes do take it for granted because we, for some of us, like for me personally, it's like grew up with it. We were told all the stories, and then it's just like I get busy. But it's truly is like the Book of Mormon is the map that we need to be consulting with in our day. It's like just like the people of the Mayflower should have been consulting with John Smith's maps. Like we need to be consulting with the Book of Mormon.
I agree. And I think that the coming forth of the Book of Mormon could not have happened without these particular people being brought to this land to lay this foundation of freedom, and particularly religious freedom. And I think it's important that we recognize that Nephi saw, the beginnings of this nation. And I'm not sure where the comment is in the scriptures. There is a comment that the only people who come here are the people that God leads.
Mm-hmm.
And so each person in our group of people that come have a purpose and a meaning, and they're here to enrich our experience or possibly be our opposition so that we always remember the freedoms that we have and the liberty and protect it and maintain it
Mm-hmm.
so that we can give it to our children and our grandchildren.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I was doing the reading, how you talked about like particularly how it's to remember that like remember us to turn to God for like our protection, our peace, and even if there is those people who come in to do the opposition. Because during the storm that John Howland ended up falling overboard, what was interesting is um, during that storm, they couldn't really direct the boat anywhere. So they basically just hoisted all the sails, just brought them all in. And it's like, we're just going to sit it out, basically. But with the Mayflower, what's interesting is they made a replica and they ended up going into the Atlantic and having to do the exact same thing. But they said, I want to actually read like a little bit of a quote from what they said about the Mayflower too. Is like, I reflected that the Pilgrim Fathers who tossed through many such a wind, night and Atlantic storms, at least knew tranquility in great gales. Because on how the boat was shaped, when the wind kind of turned it around or got it positioned in one part in the ocean, the boat felt like it was just at a standstill, like it wasn't tossing crazily. And so for those on the boat, it felt very tranquil. But during that time, that was when John Howland's like, I just need to get some fresh air. I've been down here. And that's when he went out. And then that's when he fell overboard. But it's interesting too, because like, are we allowing God to help us find that peace in the storms that we face, whether personal or as a nation? It's like, are we allowing God to direct us so that we can find that peace? And are we trusting Him to just wait out the remainder of the storm and not try to go up top to see what's going on and end up getting tossed overboard? It's like, are we having that trust with Him?
That's a really good point because I think that most of us are not feeling the tranquility or the peace, but we haven't put ourselves up. We're still fighting the storm, thinking that's what we've got to do when maybe the purpose is that we need to, just put up our personal armor and read our Book of Mormon and have faith in what our leaders say and hope that the ship rights itself and gets us
Mm-hmm.
where we want to go.
Um,
Anything you want to add, Debbie?
I don't.
I mean, I do think a little bit too, where it's like, again, it's another imagery of how everyone who came to the Americas had to go through something on the waters. Like Christopher Columbus, like we talked about last time, one of the things for him was there was a moment where there was no wind at all. And it just reminds me of like Muppet Treasure Island where they're all stuck. It's like, I got cabin fever. um, but it's like, so they had to pray and ask for wind basically. And then the Heavenly Father directed them with the wind. But then it's like Nephi, where it's like his brothers became very rebellious. And so then the storms came. So
Right.
they had to worry about that. The brother of like the people of Jared, like the Jaredites, they were in barges. They couldn't see where they were going at all.
Right.
And so they had to just trust that the Lord was taking them where they needed to go. And so it's like in all of that, you had to find some sort of peace in God.
And I know we don't talk about this a lot because, of course, we have no written history of this, but we do know through DNA that a lot of the South and Central Americans, Native Americans, have the Asian blood type. And so everyone talks about how, they came through the Bering Sea. Maybe there was a land bridge at one time, maybe not. We're not entirely sure, but we think so. Think about how, what it took for them to cross the Bering Sea, which is a cold and icy place, and then come down into the Americas and go all the way down, I mean, it took many centuries for that to happen, but still, there's something about getting to America through the sea, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, we can take an airplane, but yeah, going through the sea is. Interesting the way Heavenly
Yeah,
Father set that up. Kind of separated
yeah,
and isolated America for a long time from the rest of the world, and then here it was. But why do we call it the Promised Land?
that's a very good question. I mean, from what's interesting is I think Jerusalem is called the Promised Land, but the New World, the Americas, is called the Land of Promise. And I think it's very interesting in that because there is a whole lot of promise. In other words, like opportunity and the ability to become something and be able to live free is truly the promise of this land. It was the land that Heavenly Father said will be a land of liberty for all those who want to live here. And so it's truly is like a land of promise, in that within this land we can have every covenant that God has ever made to the children of men. And so it's important to realize that that's why this land is very important. That's why the Constitution was very important and the founding of this nation.
I think that has a lot to do with it. I think also it has some connection to the fact that, this is where Adam and Eve began, so to speak. Um, we know that from the scriptures
Doctrine
that we
Covenants.
have in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but I also think it's a promised land for every group that came here.
Hmm.
Every group that came here went through difficulties. Yes, some of the colonies, kind of faced some very tragic consequences, but for the most part, for the Native Americans and for the colonists that came, it was it was something new, some place to start over. And many decades ago, when I was in college and I was uh, studying history, one of the things they mentioned was the fact that in this land, the lure of it for early century was that you could just pack up your bags and go west or north or south. And you could get away from wherever it was you didn't like. So, in that respect, too, it was certainly a land of liberty that allowed you to be able to do that. And we can
Hmm.
still do that today. We can still just decide, I don't want to live in Alabama anymore. I'm going to move to Spokane, Washington, or some other place, you know, and that's so that promise has been kept, that it is
Hmm.
that way. And I think it's important by reading the Book of Mormon and also our history as the beginnings of our country's history, you'll see that the Lord has kept his promises when we've kept our covenant with him.
Hmm. And that's the thing too, is like in the Book of Mormon, he talks about how the Lord has promised to the Nephites and the Lamanites that they will hear the word again and it will originate from this land. So it's like it had to be this land that had the freedom of religion. It had to be this country because there was no other place that Heavenly Father promised it would happen to originate or be restored from. And so he needed to keep his promise. And he
And
always does keep his promise.
as long as we keep our covenant with him, he will keep this land free. But he will keep this land free whether we're here or not. That's the only thing he tells you is, there is a consequence. Either you do it the right way and keep the covenants, or you don't get to keep the land.
Hmm.
Yeah, he made that
Yeah,
very clear. And that
yeah,
comes
because
straight out of the Book of Mormon.
if we keep our promises, then the land will be a blessing unto us. But if we break our covenants or we forget God, we don't have that promise. We don't have that protection. We don't have the assurance that we're going to be able to have our liberty either.
Exactly.
Because even Nephi prophesied, is like, when those of this land forget God, all the nations will come to this land in war. And it's like, so it's very important to remember how sacred he deems this land and the covenants he wants us to keep here.
And we find those in the Book of Mormon because it's
Yep.
about this land and those covenants, and that's why it's so important. Well, that's really kind of all I had to say about the Mayflower Compact. Anything else, Bryce?
No, that was about it. Although one thing I do want to kind of point out, kind of like how we mentioned a little bit before we started the recording, was about how there was a time where the Pilgrims ended up getting into a war with the natives, with the Indians. And it was interesting because it didn't happen until the next generation, where it was the children
Right.
of those who came that started the war. But what's interesting is there came a point where during that war, there were a few people of the Englishmen, is how it was phrased, and a few of the Indians looked upon the others and realized like they're not as wicked as we think they are. It's like they're not as evil, and that realization was what really founded them to be able to stop fighting. And so it's like for us, it's like, can we stop looking at what we deem to be negative or the evils of other people, to be able to let that go and find the best in them, to find the true humanity and not the animalistic side of people. And it just reminded me with Pocahontas, like in the Disney movie Pocahontas, at least, where it took Pocahontas and John Smith to be able to tell them it's like, no, they're not as bad, and be able to show that they can be civil. And it was that small little act that helped stop a war. And it's like the same thing here. It's the same thing now. It's like we just need to find the best in others and stop judging and stop ridiculing and things like that.
I agree.
Which is very hard to do with media and the internet and all the negativity that people are constantly pushing on each other. So it's, that's something they didn't have to worry about. They didn't have that communication like we do now. And, you see so much negative that how do you filter past that?
Yeah.
And look for the positive, or to still stay within your own little, I'm going to find my peace from the storm and try to filter out all the negative things that the media keeps bringing up, or people bring up, or, this party or that party, all this stuff going on. How do you find that peace?
Yeah, that's very true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop recording now, okay?
All right. That's good. Sitting on our pens and needles waiting to know if you've stopped it or not, Terry.